when I got out of high school, I ended up in the Forest Service. After I dropped out of college, I ended up in the Forest Service on fire crews. And I fought fire for several years and then ended up in the Navy, did a tour in Vietnam on a destroyer, and went from there to getting back into school, becoming a shrink, and then getting drawn back into emergency shrinkage. So they would call me and send me out on large incidents. So I would go as a trauma consultant, and my job was to sort of help kind of incident commanders or crews do the best they can given a nasty circumstance. So I would do that. And then I did that for 25 years in addition to my teaching. And out of that came a whole lot of stories. And I managed to get those published by Pelicanesis in this book, Chaos and Ash. And I'd like to read to you one of those stories. And this story comes from prior to my being a shrink, but it came from a fire I was on near Santa Barbara. I understand this thing was for its time, one of the real big ones. It was 88,000 acres, which in contemporary spectacle is not so impressive, but at the time it was very, very big. And I was on it for 8 days. And so this is the story out of day 8, Sunday afternoon. Another double duty night shift was extended into the next day. By mid-afternoon on the 8th day, the fire had not only run over our stand at the saddle, jumped our line, and dropped burning embers in the tall brush and scrub oak all down the slope behind us. Those resulting spots had coalesced into a formidable run back up us from our lead. We had previously moved our engines into a safe zone a quarter mile down the truck trail to engage the fire with hand tools. This came back to haunt us. We were cut off from our engines by the new erratic and unpredictable behavior of the fire. It seemed to be outthinking us. And, you know, it really does that. The fire is smarter than we are, and it wants to kill us. There was only one way we could flee the encroaching circle of flame. It's back up the hill. We ran back up our laborious, constructed, but now worthless fire line, then back along the truck trail, and when that got too hot, up the ridge itself. We climbed and coughed, no matter, excuse me, no longer able to see where we were going. Each firefighter scrambled up the rocky slope, tool prodding the next one to move faster away from the heat. As the smoke became thicker, we simply moved uphill, despite the fact we could no longer see where we had been or where we were going. Kind of a Zarathustra moment. Our eyes burned and teared up. Snot ran down our faces and mixed with sweat, dust, and snot. Our goggles filled up and fogged over. Our bodies screamed for more oxygen. It wasn't clear whether the real enemy was now the fire or panic. Suddenly we ran out of hillside. Multiple columns of smoke were joining, obscuring both sun and sky, and there was nowhere else to go. We stood together, heaving and confused. The captains and more experienced crew bosses called us for us to trench in, and we dug furiously into the rocks and soil to create a horizontal furrow just below the bridge, the top of the ridge, in which to lay when the fire came. The ground did not cooperate. By the time the fire caught us, our trench was less than a foot deep, with the dirt piled on the downhill edge to shield us from some of the heat. As the crew boss's urging, we threw ourselves down, lying with our heads in the next person's feet, our tools covering our shoulders as we shoved our bandana-covered faces into the dirt. Then the fire came, sweeping over us by inches, sucking the oxygen right out of our lungs. Clothing spontaneously erupted, and we slapped out the fire on the legs of the next person while feeling our own legs being pummeled from behind. The sound of a forest fire rivals that of a jet aircraft. It's a deep moan, a train too close, collective cry of thousands of plants and an unwilling, transfigurative dance. When the fire is upon you, you could barely make out your friends' screams or discern them from your own. The fire wasn't the final enemy. A more pervasive threat began to weave itself around and through the crew, an insidious black threat from ourselves that came up from within. It was fear, not the frightful scares of sudden surprise or the over-concern of one who realized inevitable pain or loss. This began as a sickening dread of ending and pain escalating wildly towards self-compromising panic. The air was gone, replaced by a burning gas that scorched the throat and refused to reach the lungs. Fighting to breathe, we watched the speckled lights flicker and the darkness begin. Despite our determination to stay put, despite our terrible need to show that we could manage, chaos writhed within. We each began a countdown until we had to bolt. The black serpent of chaos and cowardice writhed within, and our claims of dignity evaporated in the face of it. Our leaders knew this. Stay in the trench, came the word down the line. Stay there, don't run. I tried to focus instead on the ground inches in front of my face. Small rootlets lay bare, grasses that would now never be. A tiny ant ran in circles trying to find safety, not comprehending the enormity of his predicament. I covered it with a handful of dirt. How odd I thought that it would likely live longer than me. The boots ahead of me were jerking spasmodically, and I realized his pants had started to burn again. I beat his legs with my gloved hands, wondering if it really mattered, wondering if his legs hurt as much as mine, wondering if I could stay there any longer. The urge to run swept over me like an obsession, and I realized I was kicking now, although it wasn't clear whether it was in response to the burn or the urge to run. I felt as if I was covered with blankets and strangling. The feet ahead were moving again, and I held them down. Something was battering my helmet, and someone else was yelling, "Move, goddammit, move out now." I looked up to find a crew boss I did not recognize crouching over me. The air thudded with another sound, helicopter blades. "Go, go," he screamed. How could he remain? What was his knowledge? Where did it come from? His certainty? And I went. The crew moved quickly, crouching low as they ran over the top of the ridge in groups. Somehow the helicopters had broken through to pick us up. The wind had shifted, allowing windows of sky to appear through the acrid ochre smoke. I was led through the haze to an army green Huey helicopter that had somehow nudged up parallel to the ridge and precariously balanced its left skid against a rock outcropping. Its blades were too close to the mountain. "Drop your tool and go," the boss shouted. "Never leave your tool," I remembered being hammered into us in fire school. Despite the cacophony of the fire and the helicopters, sound seemed muffled and time slowed down. Great brown columns of smoke rose in helical plumes, entwining one another. The captain appeared before us with a detached look, staring. His smile broke through his blackened face as if he were laughing at some private joke, and tears had coursed down the sides, washing white streaks on either side of his cheeks. He waved us forward, an actor in a slowing, silent movie. As we loped by him, he took each of us by the arm and pointed us toward the bird. It was strangely quiet as I came up to him. His eyes moved behind me, probably to gauge how close the fire was, yet they seemed to fix on something even farther off, beyond the pursuing wall of flame. His gaze slowly traveled back to fix on mine. We stared at each other as I glided by, a knowledge passing between us. It wasn't clear to me what was transpiring at that moment, but it was something about centuries and lifetimes and lives gone beyond. I never thought of him as a particularly deep man before, but in that brief moment of recognition, I realized he had been on this very spot before, and he had danced with the same snake. He come again to walk in the fire. I had been received into this etheric dimension. Heat again grew intense. I scrambled behind the others, ducking below and around the barely visible copter's blade. I dove into the open door and was pulled in by strong hands. We jammed into the seatless chopper, pulling yet another person in, grabbing support. The pilot immediately broke away from the mountain and we were airborne, making way for the next ship. The pilot swung us into a huge convection column. Immediately, the invisibility closed again. The helicopter attempted to push through towards light. We were slammed sharply upward and then almost immediately slammed more brutally back down again. Rocks and brush suddenly appeared dead ahead through the haze, the horizon disappearing crazily in hard to the right. We dove and were sharply swept up again. It wasn't clear who was screaming and who was throwing up, but we clung together, trying not to pitch out onto the floor. Pitch out of the door. Suddenly, everything went blue. We burst out of the smoke and into sunlight. As we continued the circle to the right, we saw two more helicopters darting through the windows of smoke to pull the remainder of our crew off the ridge. The fire had taken the entire mountain.